I am going to be talking about microfinance. Everyone's heard about microfinance. Uh, it may or may not be especially relevant to you. It's become quite popular, particularly since the Grameen Bank and Muhammad Yunus was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2006 for this really innovative new approach of trying to address poverty. Basically, the concept of microfinance is to provide little teeny loans, usually under $100 at reasonable interest rates compared to the usurious interest rates that the typical local lenders would provide. To provide these little teeny loans, you've got thin organization structures, no documentation, no collateral. It's a whole new concept of loaning to the poor. But the concept is that that loans to the poor would allow them to get out of their poverty situation. But of course, the question then becomes, we've got this great industry, 3,500 microfinance institutions, 30 billion under loan, 150 million families have been affected. But how do you know whether it's really affecting poverty? Only 55% of microfinance organizations have anything other than anecdotal data to suggest whether they're having an impact on poverty. Which really leads me to the research question, does microfinance have an impact on poverty? More specifically, is there some positive role that microfinance enters into on its path toward higher socioeconomic status? And that's, I'm going to tell you about a couple of tricks I've played here. One is, notice I quickly switched from poverty to socioeconomic status. What is poverty? The lack of something? Falling below some kind of threshold? Who sets that threshold? Isn't that kind of arbitrary? Instead, people who talk about poverty and research poverty often talk about this thing called socioeconomic status, which is what you have. It's a positive thing. It's easier to measure rather than trying to measure it against some binary threshold. Now, you may or may not be involved in microfinance. Maybe you've been on the kiva.com website. Maybe you even know someone who's been to Malawi, where my research took place, or maybe some South American or Central American country where microfinance takes place. But maybe microfinance is not your concern. But yet this problem of practice may be of interest in other settings as well. I would posit that any social enterprise, or maybe even social entrepreneurship, has a mission objective. And it's easy to measure the financial objectives. Are you making ends meet? But how do you know whether you're affecting housing needs in a country, in an area, or whether you're affecting environmental issues in Nigeria? How do you know whether you're affecting some of these mission or double bottom line objectives? So this is kind of like measuring poverty in Malawi, measuring the impact of microfinance. So it's maybe a more general interest than simply the question of microfinance, but we're going to use microfinance as a test bed and have some fun with numbers. Had to do two things to make this to bring this question into reality. The first thing is we needed some way of measuring socioeconomic status. Typically, when people talk about poverty and overcoming poverty, they'll use some heuristic, they'll use some metric. The most common is purchasing power parity, which is a dollarized threshold, maybe dollar purchasing power parity or $2 purchasing power parity. But it's not a very robust measure of poverty. You could have $2 of purchasing power parity, but not being able to educate your kids, or not have enough to eat, or not have a chair in your home. Does that mean you're well off or not well off? So the first thing we had to do is really create a more robust, literature-based definition of what is socioeconomic status, and really use the literature to identify what are some of the reflective measures, not formative measures, but if you say someone has higher socioeconomic status, what are you really saying they have? And it's things like good health. It's things like household effects, chairs, tables, and so forth. But with deference to Richard Boyatzis, it may be also some senses of hope. How do you feel about the things you have? Are they adequate? How do you feel about your level of poverty compared to your neighbors or compared to the economy? And how do you feel about the general economy today and next year? So there's some important. Now there are some other important things that reflect poverty that we didn't pick up in the study. For example, education. be careful, education of the wage earner is a formative measure. That creates your ability to get out of poverty. So we don't want to measure that. But education of the children in the household, now that's a reflective measure. Problem. What if your data set only has 2/3 of the households have children? Oops, now you've got invariability of the data, or you have to throw out arbitrarily 1/3 of your data. So education turned out to not to have sufficient variance to be a good indicator in a parametric study. Dwelling is another one. In Malawi, it turns out that 75% of the 11,280 people in the sample lived in mud huts with grass roofs. Not sufficient variance to really use that as a variant as an item in a parametric study. So the first thing we had to do then was use factor analysis, develop a confirmatory factor analysis on this measurement model. And much to my pleasure, I was able to identify with a small number of indicators. We'll talk about indicators in a minute. 68% of the variance in household socioeconomic status. That's pretty cool. The second part of the study really says, how does microfinance affect this thing we're calling socioeconomic status? Now, the literature will typically have you believe that it affects it directly, that most literature measures microfinance's impact directly on income. Well, that's a problem, because if I find an association, and there is an association in my data between microfinance and income, but if I find that association, what's the cause and what's an effect? Is microfinance causing higher income, or does higher income factor into the decision-making process that microfinance institutions use to give microfinance? So that really doesn't help me unless I've got experimental or longitudinal data, which I don't have, and none of the microfinance institutions have. Well, I have the same problem if I try it in a socioeconomic status, that sort of potential for reverse causation. But I can do something that I think is very interesting and very important, and probably one of the most important outcomes of this study, which is to say, what if microfinance moderated the path between income and socioeconomic status? So I earned something. By the way, I've got to pay 26% average interest on that microfinance. So I've got to have some kind of income. Microfinance somehow amplifies the relationship between that income and socioeconomic status. If microfinance enters into the picture, I can turn more dollars of income into socioeconomic status. Now I've got a relationship. I can assert, and I think you'd buy, that income causes socioeconomic status, not the reverse, right? I think you'd all buy that. And if I can establish that there's a moderation effect, then I've established that microfinance enters into that causal positive relationship. And those are two really kind of cool contributions to the literature: the ability to measure poverty, and that it's this moderating effect, not a direct effect, that microfinance enters into. So I want to go out and do yet another poverty survey, right? I found 3,600 poverty surveys that had already been done. I just couldn't see the need to do yet another poverty survey. In fact, though, the World Bank has a very powerful instrument called the Living Standards Measurement Survey. It's been done in dozens of countries around the world. Malawi is one of those countries. It takes 8 hours to implement this survey instrument per household. They collected data on 11,280 households. There's no way I could even compete with that kind of data. In fact, even if I could, there's something very useful about saying to a microfinance institution, you don't have to go out and collect new primary data. You can use some existing data. That's a valuable finding if you can actually use that then to establish a relationship. And what's more, my instrument then had been validated by several articles in the literature that had drawn on that particular data set. So I've got a good solid data set. Where many of you worried about how you're going to structure your questions, my challenge was, I've got the questions. It's like playing Jeopardy. I've got the answers. What were the questions? How can I use those to generate useful indicators that are reflective of those constructs I laid out, so that I could create my second order reflective construct? So I start with 53 pages of questions, data files that ranged between 52,000 line items and 218,000 line items. Big, big piles of data. And I had to figure out which of those questions could be useful in trying to reflect health, dwelling, and so forth. I came down to a list of potentially useful items, but even those, I mean, it would seem useful to know how many homes in a hot country like Malawi have an air conditioner. Well, except there are only 26 of them in the whole population. So that wasn't very helpful. And even things like bicycles, certainly cars, you know, there's just not enough variance. There's not enough in the sample set. And some of them were very non-normal. We mentioned the grass huts, but one of the questions that I thought reading it would be useful is how many times have you visited your village shaman in the past year? Well, unfortunately, people don't get sick that often, and people who don't get sick that often don't always go to the witch doctor. So it's not, again, that useful a question in a parametric analysis. I entered my exploratory factor analysis then with 72 items, and that led to 14 items in 5 constructs that exactly matched my theoretical model, and as I said, explained 68% of the variance. You can see the table up there, nice convergent and divergent validity. I could go through the items. Let me just touch on a couple of them. In the area of consumer durables, what the survey did was it collected the household's estimate of the resale value. So rather than just a binary, do you have a chair or how many chairs do you have, I actually got a lot of variance by having the estimated resale value. Even so, I had to create a lot of item parcels. For example, in the health area, they asked 3 questions about your current state of health for each member in the household. And it was a yes-no binary question, but across an average 4.78 household members and 3 questions, I could get some variance, even in the binary, even with the binary data. Another interesting observation, all those items that say subjective at the front were questions like we would typically ask, that ask for your opinion about something. And those tended to have much better binary distribution and tended to work very well in the factor analysis rather than the factual items. This allowed me to then create my structural model. You'll notice that it's a second-order reflective construct, this thing I called socioeconomic status. It's then, I had some control variables. Control variables were kind of hard because everyone who writes about poverty writes about things that control income rather than socioeconomic status. So you had to think a little bit about that. So I'm not going to talk much about control variables. Instead, I'll talk about the basic model. And like Shri, I'm using an interaction model. I'm saying income hopefully has a relationship with socioeconomic status. If it doesn't, then the whole moderation thing falls apart. I'm saying microfinance may have a relationship with socioeconomic status, but that's not especially interesting to me because of this cause and effect thing. But at least I have to control for it. And then I want to see the effect of this interaction factor. Now let's have some fun with numbers. Down here at the bottom, I first ran the model without microfinance in it. In other words, does just income have a relationship with socioeconomic status? And it does. It explains 73% of the variance in socioeconomic status. So first of all, they are different measures. They're not the same. And secondly, they're very closely associated. So with that causal assumption, I can now say that I've got a definition of income that has a high causal association with my definition of socioeconomic status. I can go ahead with my moderation analysis. The second thing I did then was I added microfinance without the interaction factor. And look at what happens here. I had 73% of the variance explained by income. That drops to 60%. So I've lost some of my explanatory power. So it does appear there's probably some kind of direct relationship, but I haven't theorized that. But look what happens when I add my interaction factor. The explanatory power of income itself drops to 22%. There's clearly something going on there that's affecting, this interaction factor is affecting that relationship. Notice also, remember your tests of moderation, the interaction factor is significant. Okay, I did my tests for invariance, and the models were not invariant, meaning that the whole model changed when you added the interaction factor. So I've now established, my first hypothesis was that there would be this relationship, that I did have a good relationship between income and socioeconomic status. Got it. I've got my second hypothesis established. There is an explanatory, there is a moderating relationship. That seems to be how microfinance relates to socioeconomic status. There's another direction, though. I think that all by itself would make a good study, because it goes to, if you think about, if you're a microfinance institution and you're saying, all I have to do is loan money and I'll increase their poverty, this says, no, wait a minute. That's not true. It only increases their socioeconomic status, or it mostly increases their socioeconomic status when there is income in the household. So if there's no income and you give them a loan, they can't pay the principal back, they can't pay the 26% interest back. That microfinance is in effect when it's able to shift income from a prior period and have that positive effect. Maybe because what you're really doing, the aunt died, you've got to pay for her funeral, and your alternative is to sell your table that you have to buy back later, or borrow this money that you know you can repay from future income. So there is that positive shifting effect. And that's where microfinance, we've seen, then does have a positive effect. But
3 minutes, Will.
thank you. There's another thing you can do. Now that we've got this tool that works, now I can cut the population into some different pieces and ask some of the questions that microfinance institutions have been asking. For example, what level of poverty is this really more effective on? There's this perception. The reason Muhammad Yunus created this Grameen Bank was because the perception that the very poor had no access to credit, and so this microfinance tool would have a disproportionately high impact on the ultra poor. In Malawi, what they mean by ultra poor is people who don't earn enough money to buy 2,400 calories per day. They don't even earn a subsistence living. And what it turns out, if you look at the moderator line there, it turns out that the moderation of income on socioeconomic status is not significantly different between ultra-poor and non-poor. What that basically says is that everybody has the same kind of effect from a loan, that the ultra-poor have no particular positive advantage, they have no negative advantage, no disadvantage either, that it's credit that makes a difference, not whether you're rich or poor, okay? The second cut I made, again, picking on Grameen Bank, because they're a great institution. They've really figured it out in a lot of ways. One of the underlying assumptions to most microfinance institutions is that women are better stewards of microfinance. So for example, in my qualitative research, almost everyone that I talked to said that men would tend to gamble away their microfinance or spend it on liquor. They would not invest it in things that were good for the family. And that's a pervasive theory, that women are better users of microfinance. So what does the data say? Is this moderator significantly different for men or women? Well, it is significantly different, but barely, okay? So I think the conclusion, the statistical conclusion you have to make is that women make better use of it, but I wouldn't take that to the bank, so to speak. I would say that men do use microfinance. They are able to very significantly use microfinance to improve their ability to convert income into socioeconomic status. So while technically the hypothesis was proven, I think there's a very significant implication for the industry that maybe this concern about loaning to men should be rethought. The third cut, really looking at different ways, different population subgroups, was to look at urban and rural. And very many of the microfinance programs are focused on the rural community. And again, in my qualitative research, people were asking that question, could we do this for the urban community as well? What I found really surprised me. Up in the top there, look at the moderation coefficient on urban populations. It's negative. Now what that means is if I take someone's income stream, however they're able to convert that into well-being, and I add microfinance, it decreases their ability to convert income into socioeconomic status. Now how could that be? Well, maybe in an urban setting there are more employment opportunities. Maybe microfinance is encouraging people to dabble in micro enterprises that they shouldn't be dabbling in because they should be out and getting a job. I don't know, that's pure speculation. But all I do know is that there is not a significant, but a negative coefficient, which I'm not quite sure what that means, but I can say definitely that there's a significance between rural and urban microfinance borrowers, that microfinance is better focused, according to this data, on the rural population. Okay, can I take 30 seconds on my implications?
30 seconds of will time?
Yes. Okay. I still would like to see this assumption about causation between income and SES verified with experimental longitudinal data. Obviously, this is just Malawi, and it's just Malawi in 2005. There's lots of questions about how this applies to other countries. I think the most important question for future research is how does this apply to other mission metrics, to the achievement of other missions? And in fact, even in a commercial organization, could this approach be useful for measuring customer satisfaction or something like that? And then finally, there's just whole lots of implications for how microfinance institutions should target their own efforts on rural, urban, gender, poverty levels. So that's my story.
Thank you.